Welcome to 20th Century Music and Arts. In this episode, we're going to look at the highly influential band that was clearly ahead of their time. And of course, I'm talking about Mission of Burma. Mission of Burma played a style of music that we identified with the indie rock and alternative underground scenes in the late 1980s and well into the 90s. Mission of Burma played amplified rock, and it was influenced by British post-punk, American proto-punk, free jazz, avant-garde sounds, a little bit of psychedelia, and what it had was intelligent, self-conscious lyrics, and the vocals were both melodic and aggressive. Would have been perfect in the early 90s, right? But the problem was they were making this music too early on in the rock history timeline. And there really wasn't the same sort of underground infrastructure to support them. In fact, they were one of the bands that forged the path that others would take. To look at the roots of Mission of Burma, we have to start with Roger Miller. Roger Miller was born in Ann Arbor, Michigan in 1952. And of course, he was exposed to the great bands from Detroit. He formed a band called Sprott & Layer with his two younger brothers and another friend. It was this strange psychedelic band that actually included trumpet in the sound. The band broke up in 1970, though their material would be eventually released on CD.
I want to show you a picture I made. It's red and black and blue and that's so.
Miller would go on to study music at the California Institute of the Arts and would develop a keen interest in modern composers like John Cage and Karlheinz Stockhausen, and also had a healthy love for free jazz. Eventually he found himself in Boston, where he saw an ad for someone to play in the band Moving Parts. Clint Conley, who played bass in Moving Parts, he had formed the band, and he had developed an interest in punk bands from New York, stuff like Television and Talking Heads, and he was playing with keyboardist Eric Lindgren as well. Roger Miller had joined the band, even though for a few years he had been suffering from tinnitus and wanted to avoid the volume of rock music. I suffer from tinnitus, so I can understand him wanting to do that. But with the rise of punk rock in the mid to late 70s, Miller knew this would allow him to have a fresh start in music, and it might be his last chance to do anything with rock music. So Moving Parts, they recorded a bunch of material in 1978, wouldn't actually be released till 1992. Now they have an interesting, quirky, new wave kind of sound, but they also have this jazz fusion keyboard sounds going on. But you can see the roots of some of the Mission of Burma songs, particularly like Max Ernst. The music does not have the same level of edge and aggression that Mission of Burma would have. And a split developed in the band, and Miller and Connolly really wanted to have an aggressive punk edge. Of course, they still wanted to be experimental, but in a free jazz kind of classical music from the 20th century kind of way. So they decided to split off and form their own band. Now they needed a drummer, so apparently when they were auditioning drummers, Miller and Connolly would blast things like James Brown or Sun Ra until sort of the applicant left. But one person who endured was Pete Prescott, and he'd seen Moving Parts, and he really wanted to play with Miller and Conley. Now, after playing together for a period of time, they settled on a name. Conley saw a sign for the Mission of Burma in New York, so they came up with that name. Now, they would add one more factor into the sound. Martin Swope, who actually knew Roger Miller back in Ann Arbor, they'd actually composed music together, he was brought in as the sound engineer. He would add piano and tape sounds to the band's live performances, and he'd actually tape something they were doing and then start playing it out in kind of like a remix while the band was playing live. Now this is again, a live mixing, and people in the audience are really confused. They're thinking some of these weird sounds are actually coming out of the instruments. Now this approach sometimes had an inconsistency in the quality of their shows. Some were amazing and some not so great. But the sound here was really special. While it was inspired by abstract stuff like Perubu, aggressive stuff like the Stooges, the, experimental British post-punk, free jazz, and krautrock, and this kind of stuff. It really did have quite a melodic structure to it, and it really foreshadowed the sound of college radio later on in the 80s. And they had this interesting contrast between the minimalism and the maximalism in their sound. And another factor was Miller choosing to play a cheaper guitar with one pickup. It was called the Lead One. This certainly contributed to the band's unique sound. And of course, both Conley and Miller would provide vocals, and they came up with interesting melodies and harmonies together. Now, they actually developed quite a local following, and 2 songs have been recorded, probably from a soundboard for Boston College Radio. Peking Spring and This Is Not a Photograph. Now, these recordings were actually not available to the public to purchase, but they were played on college radio, especially Peking Spring, and it was quite well liked in the Boston area. Now, their first official single would be Academy Fight Song. Rick Hart, he ran a local label called Ace of Heart Records, and he offered them a deal. Conley wrote Academy Fight Song, and it was released in June 1980. This song was melodic, but it has this post-punk angst, and again, if it had been released a few years later, it would have been huge. The song is both rebellion, but it's also a little bit cryptic in its meaning.
Walk into my room, ask me jerky questions.
Maxed Ernst was the B-side, and this is a bit more cerebral, but it's still quite melodic, and it's actually named after the German surrealist painter. The band was actually unsure of Hart's production, which was very layered and different from the chaotic sound of their live show. But when Academy Fight Song quickly sold out of its 7,500 initial copies and was becoming a big hit in the sort of Boston area and beyond, they knew they could trust Hart's judgment. The song would have a massive influence on a young Paul Westerberg, who was bringing a similar kind of melodic sound with an edge into his band The Replacements, and he apparently played the song endlessly, and eventually it would be covered by REM in 1989. But the money wasn't rolling in yet. The band got to open for bands who came to Boston, particularly the British post-punk bands of the day, bands like Gang of Four, The Cure, The Buzzcocks, and The Fall. Now, apparently Marky Smith of The Fall had said that Mission of Burma was the only band he could stand. But in that day and age, it was very interesting what kind of lineups there were, and they would also play with hardcore bands like the Dead Kennedys and Black Flag. But at that time, distribution in the underground media was kind of limited, and you didn't have things like Spin Magazine at that time, which would take some sounds that were a bit more underground and give them exposure to the mainstream. And also, quite frankly, the music was challenging, especially Miller's more cerebral compositions, which were an interesting contrast to sort of Conley's energetic anthems. So the audience was confused by the band's sort of contradictory sound. Now, even though the band made very little money, they managed to do one tour by plane. They got this unique deal for unlimited travel for a month, and it was only $300, but the catch was each flight would have to be out of Atlanta, Georgia. So, they could play Seattle, go back to Atlanta, play LA, go back to Atlanta. It was quite a topsy-turvy schedule, and again, some gigs were better than others. Now, they recorded the fantastic Signals, Calls, and Marches EP between January and March 1981. Now, again, this is a really, really good album. The EP starts with one of their most famous anthems, That's When I Reach for My Revolver. The song is such a fantastic build-up to the chorus, and this song has really stood the test of time and would be covered by Moby in 1994. That's when I reach for my revolver. Then there is the Gang of Four-esque Outlaw, but it has a heavier edge and sound than the British band. That's what the thing is with Mission of Burma. There's a muscularity that makes them kind of more rock-heavy than most of the British post-punk bands. And they're certainly way harder sounding than any of those skinny Thai bands. Now, side one ends with another driving anthem, which is Fame and Fortune, and this song has this subdued, quieter section in the middle with very interesting melodies, before, of course, they start rocking it again. Now, the dynamic and obtuse sounding This Is Not a Photograph, that opens side 2. Now, Miller's guitar goes into the territory that Sonic Youth would later invade. This dynamic sound continues into the track Red, with its strange melodies and noise, and it's kind of like this precursor to things like, I don't know, Fugazi, Unwound, and Drive Like Jehu. The drony dirge of All the World's Cowboys Romance. It's an instrumental that really hints again where stuff like Sonic Youth, Yola Tango, and even the Pixies, where they would go. You know, just incredible stuff. Now, if you get the 2008 reissue, it also includes Academy Fight Song and Max Ernst, but also these two other great tracks, Devotion and Execution. You know, you really need to check out this album, this EP. Really good stuff. While they were getting praise in the underground scenes and on college radio, they really, again, they were not having big financial success. They tried to get signed to Polygram after seeing that the band X, the LA punk band X, got signed to Elektra. But Polygram only liked That's When I Reached for My Revolver, and again, they start doing shows with the hardcore punk bands like the Dead Kennedys and the Circle Jerks, and, you know, sometimes the audiences received them well and sometimes they certainly did not. But, you know, the band soldiered on, and the chaos and experimentalism of the band's live sets is really captured on their first full-length album, Versus. It was recorded between January and April 1982, and it was released in October of that year. Now, this is an incredible album. Again, the album starts out with the crash and burn reverb sounds of Secrets. This is a real document of the Mission of Burma sound with its very ordered chaos. The song Train, it has this fantastic use of harmonics. And then there's this eerie sounding Trem 2, which has this really unique guitar sound at the beginning. So the band used this custom guitar pedal. It was apparently designed by Lou Gordiano, which created this sort of delayed tremolo effect. And it's really quite unique sounding. And the bass and drum have this sort of play this unique repetitive sound in the background. Just really, really cool. Then there was the noisy sort of free jazz art punk of New Nails. This is followed by the slow burning dirge of Deadpool. And then the great indie sounding Learn How and Side 1. Side 2 starts out with the rip roaring Mika, and then the track Weatherbox. It foreshadows again indie rock post-hardcore of the 90s with its kind of like muted strings, harmonic and noise. And then there's the pure, nihilistic, yet upbeat and rocking Ballad of Johnny Burma.
It happens anyway. It happens anyway. On the edge of Burma. We're on the edge of Burma.
Then there's the plotting Einstein's Day, followed by Fun World, which is like a groovy noise rocker. Like, kind of sounds like grunge, but with more treble. And the album ends with the energetic anthem, That's How I Escape My Certain Fate. Again, this album is absolutely unique, fantastic, and it really foreshadows where the underground would go in the 80s, and then that sound gets mainstreamed into the 90s. And on the reissued CD, you get other tracks like Forget, OK/No Way, Laugh the World Away, and Progress. But the recording sessions were very loud, and so were the live shows, and Roger Miller's tinnitus became unbearable. He would play live with just earplugs and then those industrial headphones, but the tinnitus just got worse. So it was only a matter of time before things would have to end. And Connolly had his own burnout. He had become sober in that last tour after developing a real drinking problem. And Mission of Burma had a final tour in 1983 with a mixed bag of shows in terms of consistency. And their final show would be a disastrous opening slot for Public Image Limited in Staten Island, but concerts in other parts of New York, Boston, Chicago, and Detroit, they actually got captured on the live album The Horrible Truth About Burma. That was released in 1985. They do fantastic covers of The Stooges' 1970 and Perubu's Heart of Darkness.
Maybe I'm nothing but a shadow on the wall.
Now again, the title of the album is a reference to the inconsistency of the band's live shows. But you know, the members stayed active in other projects. Roger Miller played in kind of this experimental chamber music band called the Birdsongs of the Mozoic, and he had numerous other projects like No Man and just a lot of different stuff. Conley actually became a producer for a TV news show, and he generally stayed out of music, but he did produce Yola Tango's first album, definitely a band that took inspiration from Mission of Burma. And Prescott, he played in quite a few bands like Volcano Suns, Customized, and the Peer Group. Now, in 2002, the band would reform and play live shows. They didn't play with Swope. And Miller, he put on that super strong ear protection again. And this reunion, it's documented in the movie Not a Photograph, the Mission of Burma story, and that was released in 2006. Now, in 2004, they released one new album called On, Off, On, and again, it's a solid album. And of course, people knew about their reputation, so they were starting to get more of an audience. They released 4 more studio albums: The Obliterari, I think I pronounced that right, in 2006, The Sound, The Speed, The Light, released in 2009, Unsound, released in 2012. Now, Bob Weston, who had played with Prescott and Volcano Suns, fulfilled Martin Swope's tape loops manipulator position. You know, Mission of Burma was one of the most pivotal and influential bands in the early 80s underground and would have a massive influence on 80s band of sort of the college rock underground scenes. I'm talking bands like Husker Du, The Replacements, REM, Sonic Youth, Yola Tango, and of course the indie noise rock post-hardcore bands of the 90s. They kind of continued the path that Mission of Burma had pioneered. I'm thinking of bands like Unwound, Fugazi, Drive Like Jehu, Pitch Blend, and Polvo, just to name a few. In fact, even Dave Grohl was inspired by them. Please check out Mission of Burma. Their music is unique and it was way ahead of their time. Thank you for watching 20th Century Music and Arts. Please like, share, subscribe, and comment. Remember, this is me with all my flaws, no AI. But let me know, what do you think about Mission of Burma? And hey, how about this? What other bands would you like me to do an episode on? Thank you.